few weeks ago, I happened to be rummaging through Instagram, scrolling my feed, as the kids would like to say, and all of a sudden popped up this show that I thought was so appropriately titled. I couldn't stop thinking about the title of this show. I'm very jealous that this is not the name of our show, even though we don't talk too much about religion, but it was called Talking Politics and Religion Without Killing Each Other. And started listening to some of the episodes. They had Larry Wilmore on, that Nick, from The Office, and obviously The Daily Show. And I was just listening to this, and I was just like enthralled with this show, like the title, the goals, a lot of synergies between what we try to do here at Can We Please Talk. So I invited the host of that podcast on, Corey Nathan, joining us here on the show. Corey, Mike, and Nick, thank you so much for hopping on the podcast with us.
I appreciate it, Mike, but I got to take issue with you right out of the gate, man.
Oh.
Well, I mean, you're from Jersey, so of all people to get this title right, it's you. It's Talkin, not with the G. You said the G. You're talking all proper, talking.
See, that's the Harrison right there. See, his backstory is he grew up in the Bronx, but then moved to Harrison, New Jersey. Yeah. Harrison slipped out right there. That's what that is.
That's awesome. That's a great point. You know, I forgot that you took the G off of that. Well, you know what? Let's get into this right now, because I'm so curious about your backstory. I've heard you on a few other podcasts and stuff like that. I know you've done some other appearances, and just this idea of religion and politics. We're going to get into how the GOP has really taken religion as their own, and you can't be a Democrat if you're religious for some reason, which is weird. We're going to get into that in a bit, but I'm curious from your perspective, like, what made you start this show? Give us a little bit of your backstory and some of the goals that you are seeking to aim with this show.
Yeah. So the short story is I grew up in an observant Jewish family. We went to an Orthodox synagogue, but then in my late 20s, I became a Christian. And the reason that that's relevant is I grew up a certain way. And then when I went this other route, I came to these theological conclusions. As one could imagine, I had to have some really difficult conversations with my family. Why did I do this thing? You know, why did I, becoming a Christian there's not too many things that could be worse than going home to your observant Jewish family and telling them you're a Christian. And there's a lot of reasons, historic reasons behind that. But the other thing that happened on the politics side is I realized very quickly, this is the early 2000s, I realized very quickly that some of what primarily defined my church community wasn't the theological conclusions that I had arrived at. It was political and social positions. They might not necessarily, that my friends that I went to Bible study with and friends that I went to church with might not necessarily own up to that, but that's the truth. And you see it now more than ever. You describe a person of color who basically did not have a home for much of his work life, and his ministry was leaning a certain way. And if you just read through the Sermon on the Mount, you know, a lot of people who refer to themselves as evangelicals today would say, yeah, get that crap out of here. Who the hell said that? You know, and you could be quoting directly from scripture. You could be quoting directly from the Gospels. Well, I saw the seeds of that very early on when I became a Christian. So I'd often find myself in difficult conversations, uncomfortable conversations about politics with my buddies from church. So over the years, I just realized this was something important, more so than any particular issue. As far as politics and religion, I just realized more so than any particular ballot measure, any particular politician that you're voting for, voting against, it was the ability to have these difficult conversations. And what some of our reflexive reactions when somebody said something, or when I would say, you know what, Sarah Palin, not my cup of tea. You know, I was a big McCain fan, but like when Palin started speaking, I was like, yeah, it was like a domino effect. All of these things started going off for my friends at church who were like, oh, well, you must be some sort of socialist. You're not a patriot. You're this, you're that. I'm like, where did you get that from? Like, I'm not a big Sarah Palin fan. You know, like, so it was a passion of mine to be able to do this thing better, because political issues, theological issues are important. They're important because it's how we live among each other, figuring out how to be a people together, how to go through this life thing, this country thing, this church thing together. And we weren't even doing the first step well in terms of having those conversations. So I discovered podcasting, produced my first few shows. And when I felt like we were ready, this was definitely on my heart going back to, at least 2002. So 2020 is when we officially launched this program.
There's so many places to go here. Because first off, you mentioned 2020. I'm going to go there with you then. So yeah, our shows basically share a close birthday. We started our program in fall of 2020 as well. Somewhere around November, and just getting ready for the elections. So, Corey, with that in mind, was the intention of your show, well, better yet, the intention of your show at its origin point, is that still sort of the mission statement, the driving force of the program now, or over, now soon to be 3 years, has sort of your North Star changed of what you hope the show is, what it does for its listeners?
It is definitely evolving, because I've learned about other organizations and other individuals that are in this general space. So I like to collaborate with others that are doing work along the lines of what our mission is. And our mission is pretty clear. It's talk politics and religion without killing each other, doing this thing better, right? So, you can look at Braver Angels, you could look at Village Square, you could look at any number of organizations that are doing this really, really well. And I'm trying to get involved in more of those, with more of those folks. But I would say that the mission is still ultimately the same. And it's a good compass, because oftentimes I'll go down a rabbit hole for a few weeks or even a couple of months, and I'll realize, oh, okay, well, I was thrilled to talk to whoever, John Popper, another Jersey boy. What a thrill to get to talk to Popper. And we ended up talking about politics and religion, but I go down a rabbit hole and I'm like, okay, what is it that we're really trying to do? We're trying to figure out, talk to people that exhibit the kinds of virtues, whether it's as a journalist, as an elected official, or some kind of other public figure like Larry Wilmore, who's contributing to our culture, and learn from people that I respect, especially if there are things that I disagree with that person about, how we can do this better, right? And I've learned so much along the way. And the thing is, I think a lot of folks might be under the impression that I'm doing it because I'm like the guru of doing this thing so perfectly. It's not. I'm like the worst student in the class. That's why I feel like I need to continue going to this class. So yeah, it's evolved. We've taken a couple of rabbit trails, but ultimately the compass is, how do we do this thing better? How do we talk about these important issues across our differences in a better way? So one of my favorite conversations was about a month ago, a guy that I graduated high school with, and he's a big, MAGA guy. He wouldn't call himself a MAGA guy, but at the end of the day, he's, watching Fox News all day, every day. He's a MAGA guy. But he's always, he always pipes in on social media, and, he does it with it's basically like, I listen to some of the opening monologues of a Sean Hannity show, or Mark Levin, or the Will Cow Majority. I'll listen to some of those shows just to hear how their line of thought goes, and to see if maybe there's some things I agree with, or at the very least to learn, or listen to, there's some others that I find at times pretty persuasive, actually, like Shapiro at times can be pretty persuasive. But so I'll listen to those shows, and it's funny because my buddy John, he's basically, it's like he has a diet of Sean Hannity, and everything he says to me is a regurgitation of something that Hannity said that day. So I had John, this guy, John DeRoyan, on my show, and it was one of my favorite conversations, because it started with about John's life and how he got to that point and why he believes what he believes, as opposed to getting into some, monkeys throwing, poop at each other. It was two human beings talking to each other, and me coming to a better understanding of why he has certain beliefs politically that he does. So yeah, ultimately we're trying to stay true to that and do it better.
Or to that end, as you were talking about the Beatitudes, and the Sermon on the Mount, it came, what comes to mind for me is I think about historically, when we think of the New Deal, we think of at some point Truman, trying to advocate for, a better healthcare system nationally. What seemed to be, some of the tenets of Christian ideology in terms of service. At some point, and as I say all this, I'm looking at my screen, and there's a story recently from PBS about Michael Flynn and just essentially like Christian nationalism, which is
Oh, Michael Flynn,
Yeah.
Michael / put your Bible aside Flynn. Is that the Michael Flynn we're talking about?
That's exactly who we're talking about. And that goes to what I'm sort of sitting with, which is at what point did we, not we obviously, but, and I would mention, this feels like something that maybe is being built out in America perhaps, but where what seemed to be the idea of service and the core tenets of Christianity has somehow been co-opted into a conversation about patriotism and the evils of socialism. Because I do fall into the camp of, yeah, it's like, I think the socialism argument is foolish anyway. Like it's overblown and we have basically watered down what actually that concept means. But at some point, did America just sort of lose its understanding of the message of Jesus or the gospels, sort of being pushed to the side? Like somehow in the back and forth of our political discourse, we've somehow warped what seemed to be a novel, not novel, but an important idea about service to others to somehow being a weakness and something that a portion, at least 40% of Americans find to be something that we should not be pursuing as a country. Corey, I guess from a historical standpoint, like how do we arrive here and how do you, it sounds like you deal with this in real time with the conversations that you have with others.
Yeah. I mean, we could get really theological and go to the first part of the Ten Commandments, which is thou shalt have no other God before me. Now, I'm not going to go too deep into that rabbit hole, because I'm guessing that not everybody who's listening to this is a Christian or Jewish, but there is something to that. So if you take folks who refer to themselves as evangelicals, or even folks who genuinely do go to church every week and are really believe in the authority of Scripture and the tenets and the virtues that are espoused therein, the most dangerous temptations is not the temptations that are 180 degrees off. It's not like, somebody who intuitively knows that murder is wrong, that stealing is wrong. Those aren't the temptations that are the most dangerous. The temptations that are most dangerous are 5 degrees off of what we know to be right. So you take that's where thou shalt have no other God before me. So idolatry is, if you have a figure that is co-opting the language of Christianity, that to me is much more dangerous, because you can then start to strip away the other virtues. There's another piece of scripture in the New Testament, the fruit of the Spirit, which is like, what is good, what kind of characteristics should a good person have? Love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, gentleness, self-control. The guy who used to occupy 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue has none of those things, right? Or if you look at love, what does it mean to love? Perhaps the highest virtue. Love is patient. Love is kind. It does not envy. It does not boast. That dude and a lot of his followers embody the exact opposite of that. But what is it? He's stolen and hijacked words like truth social. They've stolen and hijacked other good words like evangelical in the religious realm. Yeah, I'm an evangelical. Of course I'm an evangelical. I follow Trump is how the thinking goes. I'm a good evangelical and therefore I follow Trump. Or even in the the civics realm, like patriot. How did patriot become a stacked word? How did the American flag? I see a big American flag waving, and it's sad to say, I think I know a lot about that guy already who's driving that big truck with the big wheels. That's sad. By the way, for the record, my kid, I'm not going to tell you he's my favorite kid, but he's my favorite kid right now. Anyway, he's got a big truck with big wheels, but it shouldn't be stacked before I even meet the human being who's driving that truck. It shouldn't be stacked before I meet the person who lives in that house that's waving the big old flag. But a lot of these symbols and a lot of these words have been hijacked. It's an idolatry, and it's a dangerous idolatry, because it doesn't look the opposite of what we think good virtues are or godliness is. It looks just enough like it that will follow, right? So that's what we got to be on guard for. And I think a lot of the folks who refer to themselves as evangelicals, and this is not a new problem, by the way. This is a historic problem going back to at least the time of Constantine. Once we started mixing civics or the idea of nation or the idea of empire with religion, then it becomes a dangerous project that we're involved in. So I don't know if that answers your question, but like that's a lot of the It's not a new problem, but that's a lot of what's going on.
Well, it actually funnels into the follow-up question that I have for you, Corey, which was, before this recording, I started looking up the evangelical vote for Donald John Trump previously in the 2020 and 2016 election. 81% of the
81,
white
yeah.
evangelical Christian vote in 2016, 75% in 2020. And I sit here with this dichotomy that I live because I worked at Fox News for a few years. I would hand scripts to Sean Hannity from '04 to '06. I am a Christian, right? And there are parts of me that just don't agree with the philosophy of this modern day Republican Party. So I'm curious for your perspective because you've had so many different people that not only have been on this show, but are also journalists. They cover this, the voting issues. People say that they're now single voter issues, like they'll vote on a specific issue. If this is a referendum on abortion, I'm going to vote on that because that candidate believes in XYZ. Two-parter. How has the Republican Party taken Christianity away from people that live on the Democratic side of the aisle that are Christians themselves? And then also on the flip side, the messaging part of this. How do you message? You just said a little while ago in the response to Nick's question about some of the stuff from scripture doesn't fit the profile of that voter. How does the Democratic Party, in your estimation, message to that voter and say, hey, you believe in these things? These things are against it. This is antithetical to what you say you subscribe to.
Yeah.
So how do you think the Democratic Party should message to that base, which has a stronghold right now on the GOP side? And then how do you think the GOP has really taken Christianity and made it like their own?
Yeah. So as far as the GOP, or what used to be known as the GOP, how did they hijack or co-opt Christianity as their own? That's a project that's been going back since at least the 60s. There were certain operatives that recognize certain issues. I'll even say, and this can be a much longer conversation, but I would even say that it goes back to segregation, late segregationists in the 60s that then identified other issues, like when Roe v. Wade got passed in, I guess that was 73, that then hitched their wagon to these other issues and then started expanding it through the 80s. Jerry Falwell with the moral majority. There were these movements that had been building up. And then I think there were other ingredients that only exacerbated these trends that were going in a certain way. Like if you look at Fox News, their agenda is not necessarily to be a news organization. Their agenda is a business organization. And I don't fault them for that, but it is what it is. And Rupert Murdoch recognized that anger sells and fear sells, not necessarily the hard news. Otherwise, he'd be doing a version of PBS NewsHour. That's not what they're doing. They've been doing this thing since the get-go. Rush Limbaugh discovered that once in '87, the law passed. I forgot the name of the law that allowed for political radio to take hold. But Rush Limbaugh discovered this entertainment-oriented news-ish type stuff. And he recognized what was expanding his audience: rage and fear, as well as divisiveness. You turn on Rush Limbaugh and he was entertaining, but he found a really entertaining way of saying Clinton is wrong, Clinton is stupid, I was right by my book. So Fox News figured out the same thing, and they just built a whole media ecosystem based on that. So the divisiveness is, we've gotten to a point through that, because we're being fed all of this information, to the point where someone couldn't even imagine the possibility of voting for a Democrat. They've grown up this way. They forgot what the Southern Baptist Convention's stance on abortion was circa 1972. And it was a much more nuanced stance. It looked a lot more like what Chris Christie's stance is. They believe in life at conception and protecting an unborn life, with the exception of rape, incest, and life and health of the mother. They even had a more liberal, if you want to call it that, stance than what Chris Christie has, because they talked about the health of the mother, the emotional and mental health of the mother, in their statement in the early 70s before Roe v. Wade. So even the Southern Baptist Convention had a much more nuanced stance on abortion. But the factors in our culture have made it so that individuals who are consuming that. That's what they're feeding their brains, and that's what they're embodying. They can't imagine the possibility of voting for a Democrat. Now, how should the Democrats message accordingly? I don't necessarily think that's the project. I think the project first is weaning somebody off of the crack cocaine, that, you know, the political, social, entertainment, content-oriented crack cocaine that they're shooting into their minds every day via Fox News and these other programs. You know, put it down, put it away, give yourself a news fast. Give me 1 day. Can you do 1 day? Give me 2 days, and let's talk at the end of 2 days. See if you've been thinking about this stuff in a little bit of a different light. Wean yourself off of that stuff, and maybe allow for the possibility that there's a good reporter that works, dare I say it, for the Washington Post. If you can't understand, and same thing with me, I found good reporters, hard reporters that work for Breitbart. I found good reporters that work for Fox News. I found good journalists that work for a lot of these organizations. You just have to be discerning and find who they are. I say that to my friends that I go to church with, or other friends that are very hard right. I say, well, do me a favor. I'm not asking you to read the entirety of today's Washington Post and New York Times, but go look for a Bob Costa story. Look for a story that Bob Costa, if you can't come back to me, read 3 Bob Costa stories. If you can't come back to me and tell me that he's a good reporter, regardless of where his stories show up, then you're just not an objective person. You don't know what news is. You don't know what journalism is. And then we have to have a different conversation. And maybe we should go to a community college class together to figure out what that actually is. So it's a different conversation at that point. The biggest thing in terms of persuasion, and this might be another part of the conversation when it comes to Democrats and messaging to Democrats, it really is part of the larger conversation of if I get into a conversation with an agenda, that it's almost like a contest, and I want to prove my point, and I want to convince you of something, like a salesman. I want to sell you on the idea, my friend from church, of the possibility of voting for a Democrat. I'm never going to win. That's not a conversation or transaction I want to enter into. I want to enter into a relationship, as opposed to the transaction of convincing them and thinking that I'm going to win this argument. That doesn't work. It might work for other people. I'm not really a big fan of it. I'm not really a big believer in it. I'm a big believer in relationships. I could go on about this point, but the way that gay marriage went from the issue that arguably won George W. Bush his second term because they got, initiatives on more than half of the state's ballots in 2004, to where it was so widely accepted, and it ultimately passed the Supreme Court, is the argument, the way that folks were persuaded was they started to think about people in their lives who they knew that were gay. As opposed to thinking about it as an issue, they thought about their relationships. And I think a lot of things go that way, where I don't want to convince anybody of anything. I want to be in a relationship with somebody, and I can invest in relationships. And through that relationship, we'll ultimately persuade each other on different things. So the second half of your question is a little different way to think about it, but that's what comes to mind.
Quick break from our pod to tell you about a new pod at Fresh Roasted Coffee, Envy Pods. So if you go to freshroastedcoffee.com, my partner's shaking his head. That's a good transition. What are you kidding me?
It was good. No, I shook my head. I was like, that's brilliant.
Thank you.
Because I saw this picture earlier. I was like, I saw what you're doing.
It is pretty good. That's right. So listen, the new Envy Pods over at freshroastedcoffee.com, the official sponsor of Can We Please Talk, environmentally safe, compostable. You can go check these out at freshroastedcoffee.com. When you open up the package, it smells delicious. I'm telling you, you can't smell it on here, but I promise you that when I opened this morning to make my cup of coffee, it was delicious. Head to freshroastedcoffee.com today. Use the promo code CANWEGET20 for 20% off your first order, or hit the link in our show details. Well, Corey, I got to be honest because I got to follow up to that. One of the things that we've done on this show is media literacy. You don't need that community college class. You got two journalism grads here from Rutgers University. You got one that went to Connecticut School of Broadcasting. And then the other one that I just told you would put some of this stuff in the prompter that the person's reading. There's a reason why Fox Nation is still around and CNN Plus is not. There's a reason why PBS NewsHour gets 2.1 million, and that's not even close to what the 5 p.m. show gets at Fox News. And you said a lot of those things there. And I would argue, or at least piggyback on top of that, that there's a level of disingenuousness with a lot of these folks, specifically the ones that are in this content game, right? The Dan Bonginos, you mentioned Mark Levin, even Ben Shapiro. Okay. As much as he could be persuasive, there's a level of disingenuousness that comes with it. They got to wake up every morning and say, this is what I'm going to do. The reason I know Nick and I are not rich is because we don't do that. We don't do that just yet. We don't commit fully to it. They're pot committed right now. They can't go back. At 9:01, when President Biden saves the Earth from blowing up with an asteroid, we're still going to run that Hunter Biden graphic because I already loaded it in the machine. And that's something that Sean Hannity can't get away from. Is he conservative? Sure. But can he come out at 9:01 and say President Biden has saved the universe from catastrophe? He can't do it, Corey. So my question to you would be, with your show trying to get these polar opposites and these forces pulling against each other, to try to align them to just come to this middle, this common ground, as you have done in some of your episodes, what would you recommend to people right now? You said to shut it off for a day, news and stuff like that. Tough to do, but what is something you would recommend to folks that are listening to not only our show, but your show, and they want to talk about these things and want to learn more about these things, but like, how do they interpret some of this stuff? How do they go about judging these folks? Because to the untrained eye, they can't discern the difference between an opinion commentator, a journalist at that network, a host at that network. I know all of it because I've been behind the camera. What would you say to that person that's listening to this, that's listened to your show, or even somebody in your friends group that's like, I don't understand. What's a way that I can vet some of this stuff? How would you convey that to somebody that's listening to our program right now, or even listening to your show?
Well, I would say a couple things. One is understand what's actually happening, and you can find out. I mean, we have, guys, I've had a few guys on the show, and I'm sure you know a few of these folks too, who Charlie Sykes comes to mind, Joe Walsh comes to mind. They both had national audiences, nationally syndicated radio shows, and they both told me something similar that they did. Their MO was to come in as conservatives. They're part of the Never Trump crowd, but both of them part of the Never Trump crowd now. But as conservatives, when they had their national shows, they would come in, and one of their most common tactics was to find something asinine that some Democrat, liberal, progressive did somewhere in the world, one person, and then make that the show of this is what they do. So they call it nut picking. You take some nut somewhere who did something stupid, and then you turn it into this is what the liberals do. And if you listen to a lot of the shows, it's a Mark Levin, a Sean Hannity, they're all some different version of each other, and they go about it in such a way that they're educating their audience on them, and the them is broadly defined as anybody who doesn't bow down at the orange god, the orange president god, former president, or I'm being kind of curt about that, but anybody who's outside of their certain orthodoxy, right? So that's labeled as rhinos, as never Trumpers, as liberals, as progressives, as socialists, as Marxists. So number one, recognize that, right? But number two, and it's just as important, if not more important, don't give up on the rest of them, right? So I'm not saying, so if somebody says to me, yeah, I'm a big Ben Shapiro fan, and I do like one or two of the shows I'm on the West Coast, so between 5 and 8 o'clock on Fox News, but I forced myself to watch MSNBC. I forced myself to watch Rachel Maddow. And I'm like, nothing against Rachel Maddow, but I'm like, that's not necessarily the way to go. Like, that's a whole different thing. Find good reporters. Read some Maggie Haberman. Read some Bob Costa. Find good reporters. Understand what good reporters are, and find them. So understand what the recipe is that's being followed by a lot of the folks that you're taking in on a daily basis. Understand what it's doing to you. It literally is. If you listen to Denver Riggleman, former congressman who is doing a lot of the intel for the January 6th Congressional Committee, Republican, by the way, and he says the chemical reaction, the neuropsychological chemical reaction, is almost exactly what happens. I referred to it as crack before. That's what happens. It's like a hit of crack. How your brain reacts to confirmation bias, listening to how all those people are this and all those people do that. That's what that is. But again, don't give up hope, because there are good journalists doing good work, and find some of them. Okay, so you can't bring yourself to read the Washington Post? Fine. There are plenty of other publications. There's New York Times, the Washington Post. There's plenty of other publications, even Yahoo News, for goodness sake. You can find good reporters. The Hill is a great publication. That's a nonpartisan publication. And there's some great reporting being done there. So those are the two things. Understand what's the recipe, the formula that's being duplicated. But at the same time, don't give up hope, because there's great journalism being done.
You consider part of Joe Biden's success the fact that he's openly Catholic.
Yeah.
Talks about his faith, and it stood out more so than the other candidates in 2020. And even now, he seems to be the rare candidate who bridges the gap between what I would consider folksy, very organic display of faith and just open about it, coupled with really just sort of mastering and understanding and making clear the Democratic platform. Is that sort of the secret sauce that he's got going on?
Well, it's a genuine faith. I think that his faith is genuine. It's not this fast food rapping, and I'm going to use some words to generate some clicks to some version of virtue signal my Christianity. You learn some words and phrases and you appeal to that crowd. That's not what it is. It's a genuine, grounded faith that comes through literally practice. His practice of going to church every Sunday, his practice of taking communion, his practice of being in communion with the people that he goes to church with. Same thing with Barack Obama. I know people that go to certain types of churches, fundamentalist churches, can't even imagine the possibility that somebody with a D before their name is a genuine Christian. But if you listen to Barack Obama's story of faith, his testimony, that dude believes. He believes because of his family, because of the influence that his wife has had on him, and same thing with Joe Biden. But because they have a D before their name, folks can't bring themselves to believe that they can't possibly be a real Christian. You know what that sounds like? That sounds like the institutional church in where my family's from, Ukraine. Oh, well, those guys are wearing crosses on their helmets. Just the fact that they go to, shtetls and burn down houses and literally behead my ancestors. Oh, no. But they're wearing crosses on their shields. So they must be the real Christians. But the faithful people, the people of God, no. They belong to a different political party. So they can't possibly be the real people of God, So I recognize this. Maybe it's because I'm Jewish. Maybe because I know my family's story. But I recognize this from a mile away. What that is you're going to get me off on a tangent here, but I am encouraged and inspired. Listen, I don't agree with all of Biden's positions on things, but Biden, if you look at it, what has been the secret to his success? And yes, his administration has been effective. What is the secret to it? It's his ability and willingness to negotiate across the aisle. You look at the biggest pieces of legislation, whether it was gun reform a little over a year ago, whether it was they called it the Inflation Act, but it was really about prescription drugs and some things on the, some energy policy. And who led negotiations on that? It was Manchin, the most conservative Democrat in the caucus. Who led gun reform? It was John Cornyn, a Republican from Texas. Even recently here with the debt limit, he kicked everybody out of the room, negotiated directly with Kevin McCarthy, the Republican, House Speaker. The Bipartisan Infrastructure Act, or even like in foreign affairs, he has bipartisan support in terms of what he's doing in Ukraine. And arguably, he's repaired a lot of the damage that Trump himself did in terms of our allies in Europe in this instance. And he's strengthened the coalition of partners that we need around the world, as well as done the miraculous. It wasn't him personally, obviously, but his support of Ukraine has helped Ukraine do the next to impossible, which is stave off an entire empire that's falling down upon them. And they're the bastion on that line of democracy. What is that success? The success is bipartisanship. It's not going further to his left. Not that there's anything necessarily wrong with that, but he's the representative of the United States as a whole. So the idea that he's negotiating and collaborating with people to his right, he needs to do it because that's representative of the United States as a whole. So it's all, to me, that's all connected to his grounding in faith, because he has a sense of the transcendent that allows him to tap into these transcendent virtues and thus remembers the humanity of his loyal opposition, doesn't dehumanize a John Cornyn who led the gun legislation reform. He humanizes him and works with him and collaborates with him. So I think it's all tied together.
Yeah. Corey, before we let you go, and we could talk about this stuff all day, man. And by the way, I love some of the answers because you can see the emotion that is coming to you as you're responding to it. As we're recording this, the former president of the United States is getting set to potentially face a fourth indictment in Georgia, election interference, the phone call that he made with Secretary Raffensperger down there in Georgia. He's already facing 3 other indictments. And the reason I'm bringing it all together is because some of it's intertwined into tackling our democracy, right? And changing some of the foundations of this democracy. You're part of a larger podcast group, the Democracy Group. It's a network of podcasts, and the goal of helping listeners understand what's broken in our democracy. So, Corey, I want to give you a couple of minutes here. Tell us, A, about the Democracy Group, and B, what is broken in our democratic system?
Yeah, it's a great network of podcasts. There are some larger ones that are in the top, half of 1% of podcasts in the world. There's some other indies that don't have the scale of some of the bigger ones. But what we're all doing together, and I give Jenna Ellis and Brandon a lot of credit for organizing this network. It is exactly what you said. It's a network of podcasts that examines what's broken in our democracy, but more importantly, how we can work together to fix it. So I just did a collaboration this week with the Common Ground Committee, and they have a couple of different podcasts. How Do We Fix It is one of them. And they aired a conversation I had with Lene Erickson on, she belongs to the Third Way. We're all kind of doing some version of the same thing, trying to figure out, hey, what's going on here? Trying to diagnose some of the ailments and then identifying the prescriptions for how we can do it better. I've identified that's talking about politics and religion. My friends, Liz Joyner at Village Square, they've also identified that race is a big, and obviously it is. It's not, so I work with Liz, even outside of my network of the Democracy Group network. I work with Liz and I help her produce Village Square Cast. I also work with Lisa Sharon Harper. She's a wonderful scholar and social justice leader. And she has a show called the Freedom Road podcast. And she has an organization called Freedom Road. So anyway, the Democracy Group, we're all in this space. It's politics, it's race, it's our civics. What's broken? I think number one, it is before we even have an opportunity to know someone, is we've identified them. We take one data point about that person and then we dehumanize them or mischaracterize their views and vilify them based on the fact that I had somebody do it to me. You've only lived in Jersey and California, you're a New Yorker and a Californian. What could you possibly, and first of all, he doesn't have my biography correct, but that's neither here nor there. But based on where I've lived, he's already identified that, everything he needs to know about me, and then begins to mischaracterize my own views. I happen to be right of center, especially on fiscal issues. And also goes about vilifying a guy like me. And we all tend to do that. Like me, seeing a guy with the big, Make America Great Again decal on his big old truck. So that's what's broken, is we begin to mischaracterize, generalize, and vilify people based on one thing that we might know about them, one data point that we might know about them. That's problem number one. So the solution to that is rehumanize, right? And we can't do that in general. We can't do that, cast a wand and like, now the 330 million people who live in America, I've now rehumanized. No, no, no. A lot of folks get frustrated when you think about, oh, well, everybody is, this way or that way, and our country's gone to crap because everybody. No. I can't think that way. Because you could frustrate yourself to no end when you think that way. What I can do is I can remember that my neighbor that I see on our walks every morning, he happens to have Fox News on all the time when I go into his house, but I go into his house and I have dinner. He's a great cook and his wife makes dessert. It's to die for. He's originally from Italy. He's my buddy Pete. I call him Pete, Pierino, like little Pete. And great cook. So I, instead of like, oh, he's got Fox News on, forget it. I'm not going to have anything to do with him. No, he's my buddy. He's Pete, he's my neighbor. So one person at a time, remembering the humanity of them. They're a lot more than what bumper sticker might be on their car or what flag they might be waving in front of their house. They're a human being, a nuanced human being with a story. And the last one I'll say is what Braver Angels is all about. They'll remind you, if you do have the opportunity to get into a conversation with somebody, get into it, but like get into it and tap into who they are as a human being. And instead of saying, well, why do you think that and have a bunch of bullets that you're going to fire at them, like rhetorical comebacks, instead of that, have this like curious disposition, a default posture of curiosity about who they are. Well, what happened in your life? Like, tell me about your life. Like, how did you arrive at that conclusion? I talked to another buddy who, big gun advocate, and being out here in California, it's kind of a big deal for him, because we have some of the most strict gun laws in the country. Well, for him, it started when he was a kid. It was a rite of passage with his dad, and his dad recently passed away within the last couple of years. So it hits really close to home. Far be it from me to tell that guy all the things he's wrong about when it comes to guns. First of all, he probably knows a lot more about it than I do. So instead I could develop a relationship. Maybe I can learn something from him about the history of gun legislation. But more so, I can learn about him personally. I can learn about a guy who's devoted to his dad, who reveres his dad. That's something that I can relate to, no matter how much we might disagree with about the legislation. So tap into human beings, invest in relationships, remember they're rehumanize people, don't dehumanize people. These are just some of the things I think we can do.
Very well said. Talking politics and religion without killing each other. And I left the G off just for you there. Corey, Nathan, you do a great job with the show, my friend. Continued success to you, sir. Welcome back on the program anytime. Please stay safe, my friend.
Mike, Nick, thanks so much. You guys are fantastic. I really enjoyed talking to you. And I definitely hope to continue this conversation.
Hey, thanks for watching the Can We Please Talk podcast. Whatever clip you just watched, we hope you enjoyed it. And we hope you stick around for some more. Subscribe to the channel. My partner's over here smashing the button. Come on, do him a favor. So hit subscribe.